Hello, and welcome to the ASME.org webinar, Engineering for Human Rights, Opportunities, Risks, and Responsibilities. I'm Dave Walsh, editor of the ASME.org website, and I'll be the host of today's event, which is being co-sponsored by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, and Engineering for Change, E4C, two leading nonprofit organizations dedicated to the betterment of humanity. Today's presenter will be Jessica Wyndham, Associate Director of the Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights, and Law Program at the AAAS. Jessica has worked extensively with national human rights institutions throughout Asia, the Pacific, Africa, and the Americas, including as legal advisor for a project of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Ecuador. Prior to joining the AAAS, she was the legal advisor on IDP issues for the Brookings Institution project on internal displacement. Jessica holds an LLB with honors, JD equivalent, from the Australian National University and an LLM from the University of New South Wales. And now a word on our sponsor organizations. ASME is a not-for-profit membership organization that enables collaboration, knowledge sharing, career enrichment, and skills development across all engineering disciplines toward a goal of helping the global engineering community develop solutions to benefit lives and livelihoods. Founded in 1880 by a small group of leading industrialists, ASME has grown through the decades to include more than 120,000 members in over 150 countries worldwide. Our first co-sponsor, the AAAS, is an international nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing science around the world by serving as an educator, leader, spokesperson, and professional association. In addition to organizing membership activities, AAAS publishes the journal Science, as well as many scientific newsletters, books, and reports, and spearheads programs that raise the bar of understanding for science worldwide. Our second co-sponsor, E4C, is a dynamic and growing community of over 10,000 engineers, technologists, social scientists, NGOs, local governments, and community advocates, whose mission is to improve quality of life in communities around the world by facilitating the development of affordable, locally appropriate, and sustainable solutions to the most pressing humanitarian challenges. E4C's approach is to provide a common forum for supporting connection, collaboration, knowledge exchange, and content aggregation with complete openness, transparency, and accessibility. E4C extends its impact by facilitating partnerships with organizations that are on the ground, defining needs and implementing appropriate solutions. Originally conceived by the ASME, E4C is a global alliance that includes the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, IEEE, Engineers Without Borders USA, EWB USA, the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE, the Society of Women Engineers, SWE, and more. The E4C coalition represents 800,000 member engineers and technologists from industry and academia throughout the world. Your feedback is important to us, so if you have any questions for Jessica during today's event, please type them in the box at the bottom of the screen, and we will answer as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. And questions we do not answer will be answered via email after today's event. So now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jessica for her presentation. Jessica?
Great. Thanks very much, Dave, and thank you to ASME and to everyone who's joining us for this webinar. As Dave said, my name is Jessica Wyndham, and I'll be leading the webinar today. I'm a human rights lawyer who has the privilege of working daily with scientists, with engineers, and also with health professionals. These are individuals who are interested in and committed to addressing human rights through their work. For the past 5 years, I've worked at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, we're also known as AAAS, where I'm currently Associate Program Director of the Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights, and Law Program. Now, before we begin this webinar, I would like to get a sense of who you are and the background you bring to this webinar. So I invite you to complete the following poll. Just take a moment to complete that poll, and we can then review the results. Okay, well, thank you very much. It seems that a lot of people in our audience have contributed to a development project, which is wonderful. Several have also contributed to human rights projects. They've taught about human rights in their work and conducted research. And fewer have contributed to human rights policy development. We have just one more poll before we get started, and that's just to find out what your interest is in this topic. Is it personal, is it professional, or is it both? If you could complete that poll, that would be great. Then we'll review the results before we move on. Okay, so the vast majority of you are interested in this topic both for personal and professional reasons, and a small fraction of you are interested in it for either personal or professional reasons. Well, it's good to get a sense of who you are and why you're coming to this webinar. And now to outline for you what I plan to cover in the next 40 minutes or so. This presentation, it's going to be an introduction to each of the questions outlined on the slide. What I hope you come away with from this conversation is a general understanding of what we mean when we talk about, human rights. The breadth of connections that exist between your professional expertise as an engineer and human rights, some questions you should think about when aiming to do your work in a way that is consistent with human rights, and the opportunities that exist now for you to get engaged in human rights work. So before we begin, it's important to explain what we're talking about when we say human rights. We're talking about fundamental entitlements that are guaranteed by law, and that may be international law, regional, or domestic laws. They're inherent to all human beings on an equal and non-discriminatory basis, and they're derived from the mere fact of being human. It's the obligation of government to ensure the realization of human rights according to law. At the same time, we all have a role to play in ensuring the enjoyment of human rights by everyone. In my presentation, I'm going to speak briefly about the wide range of issues addressed by human rights, then focus most of our time on the various practical connections between these human rights and the work of engineers. Now, when talking about modern human rights law, our starting point is always the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was a document drafted by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, which was chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, and adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. The original idea was for the declaration to be a legally binding document, but there was a political and philosophical divide at the time it was drafted. The East was in favor of protecting what are known as economic, social, and cultural rights, and the West favoring protection of civil and political rights. The result was the adoption of a non-binding declaration and the later development of two binding but separate treaties on each of these sets of rights. Those two treaties are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Both were adopted in 1966. The Covenant on Civil and Political Rights recognizes the right to life, to freedom from torture, to a fair trial, the right to information, freedom of expression and association, amongst other rights. For many of you, these rights will be quite familiar. Indeed, in most cases, these are probably rights contained in your national constitution. The Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights recognizes, for example, the rights to education, to work, to housing, to health, water, and sanitation, and to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. Already, you'll be able to see connections between the rights covered by international law and the work of engineers. Now, in addition to those two treaties, there are several more that have been developed in the last almost 50 years, including treaties on race, on women, torture, children, migrant workers, and people with disabilities. What you see here in this slide is the number of countries that have ratified, that is, agreed to be legally bound by each of these treaties. The maximum possible is 196. So you'll see that ratification of the treaties on children, women, and race, for example, is quite widespread. The newer treaties on migrant workers and people with disabilities are still slowly attracting acceptance. It may be of interest to know that in the US, only 3 treaties have been ratified: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Conventions Against Racial Discrimination and Torture. A further 4 treaties have been signed. That is, the government has indicated an intention at some time in the future to ratify these treaties. Now that you have a very basic grounding in the fundamentals of human rights, I want to turn to the question of how engineering and human rights are connected. But first, I want to invite you to complete a poll indicating the connections you see between engineering and human rights. Now, the options you have here are, and you can choose as many as you'd like, engineers have human rights, engineers can apply their skills to human rights, engineers and applications of engineering may negatively impact human rights, engineers can contribute their voice to human rights, and there is a human right to benefit from engineering. I'll just give you a moment to complete that poll, and then I'll show the results. Great, thanks very much. It's interesting to see that the majority of responses, almost 100% of people, have said that engineers and the applications of engineering may negatively impact human rights. We also have a large number of you, 88%, indicating that engineers can apply their skills to human rights, and an even 77% saying that engineers have human rights, they can contribute their voice to human rights, and that there is a human right to benefit from engineering. So there's obviously wide support for each of these connections between engineering and human rights. So thank you for that. And now I'm going to explore each of these connections between engineering and human rights, starting with the basic fact that engineers, like all human beings, have human rights. Engineers also have rights particular to their status as engineers, including the right to associate in professional engineering societies, to enjoy the freedom necessary to conduct research, and the right to disseminate information and knowledge about engineering. The rights of engineers as well as their scientist colleagues, however, are sometimes violated. As members of an educated minority, scientists and engineers may adopt public roles, for example, that put them in conflict with ruling elites. The two photos you see are of two engineers, Dr. Abdul Jalil Al-Singasi, he's a mechanical engineer, and Professor Masood Jahromi is a telecommunications engineer. Both have been arrested for speaking out against their government on issues of human rights. Professor Jahromi has been released, but Dr. Al-Singasi is serving a life sentence. Even in open democracies, the rights of engineers may be curtailed. National security, for example, is often a reason given for limiting the ability of foreign engineers to enter a country, to attend meetings, or to collaborate with colleagues across borders. Other examples include restrictions on the import and export of equipment and other tools of engineering. Moving now to the second connection between engineering and human rights, and that is that engineers can contribute their voice to human rights. One question I'm often asked is, why me? As an engineer, as a scientist, what do I have to add? My response is that governments have voluntarily assumed responsibility for ensuring human rights are enjoyed by everyone. However, the commitment of government is only as strong as society's demands for their rights. What is more, engineers have particular skills and abilities that can be applied to human rights questions. When engineers apply their technically rigorous and independent analysis to human rights questions, they're adding credibility to human rights demands. A forum provided by AAAS for professional societies to engage in human rights and to bring human rights to their members is the AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition. The coalition is a network of scientific and engineering societies that recognize a role for scientists and engineers in human rights. The American Society of Civil Engineers is an active member of the coalition. However, at the moment, it's the only engineering association that's part of the coalition. And I must say that we welcome the involvement of many more engineers in the work of the coalition. And I invite you to email me following this webinar if you want to learn more. In an effort to reach out to the engineering community, the next meeting of the coalition is focused on the topic of technology, engineering, and human rights. The meeting will be held on July 16-17 at AAAS headquarters here in Washington, D.C., and we're going to address issues such as, is there a human right to the internet? Technology for human rights and volunteer opportunities, integrating human rights in technology and engineering curricula, the human right to clean water and sanitation, technology, human rights, and professional responsibility. You're certainly all invited to attend the meeting. And for those of you who are members of a professional society, there are various ways you can engage your society and your colleagues in human rights. Examples coming from scientific and engineering societies include take up an issue of central concern to your discipline and hold a public inquiry to identify the human rights dimensions of the issue, come up with recommendations and potentially policy outcomes. Conduct a review to determine how human rights might be incorporated into your code of ethics, or request a hearing before an international human rights tribunal, such as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, on a human rights issue related to engineering. Now, before we go on to talk about the third role of civil engineers in human rights, I want to invite you to complete another poll. This is about how can engineers help address specific human rights issues. And the issues I've laid out here on the poll are, for example, access to mobile health technologies in rural communities, access to potable water, access to the internet in remote regions, access to sustainable sources of electricity, and access to basic infrastructure, such as roads and schools. So I'll give you a moment to complete that poll before sharing the results. Great, thanks very much. Well, there's obviously, again, clearly an identification that engineers can contribute to all of these issues. There's less support for the notion that engineers can contribute to providing access to mobile health technologies in rural communities, but still with 77% of you highlighting that, it's obvious that there are many ways in which engineers can help address human rights issues. And so that brings us then to the third connection between engineering and human rights, and that is engineers can apply their knowledge and skills to human rights challenges. Now here it's important to highlight that there are several ways in which scientists and technical experts have contributed to human rights work in the past. I'm just going to outline for you some of the examples with which you may not be familiar. For example, following the dirty war in Argentina in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, state-sponsored violence led to mass human rights violations, including the killing, the detention, and disappearance of up to 30,000 people. Following the dirty war, the new Argentine government began a process of trying to uncover the truth of what had occurred and to determine what had happened to the people who had disappeared. Here on the left, we have a picture of Clyde Snow, formerly of AAAS. He's a forensic anthropologist, and Snow applied his skills to the identification of human remains. Here he is testifying in a case concerning the disappearance and killing of Liliana Pereira, a 21-year-old bank clerk who disappeared, was killed, and was actually found to have given birth before she was killed. This sort of application of forensic anthropology continues in many countries around the world as part of large-scale human rights investigations. In another example, a statistician, Patrick Ball, developed an information management system to assist in the analysis of data collected from approximately 800,000 Kosovar refugees who were fleeing Yugoslavia. Through the development of this system, Patrick was able to answer the question of how many people were displaced, from where, when, and what was the likely cause. He later provided testimony on this issue before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the trial against Slobodan Milosevic. And then the last example I want to give you is of work that we are doing here at AAAS that focuses on the application of geospatial technologies for human rights purposes. Here you have a before and after image of the Port Farmer region of Zimbabwe. The government, as part of its program to eradicate slums, almost completely demolished every structure in the area. These images were used by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to address issues of human displacement in the region. We've also produced other similar mapping evidence of human rights violations for Darfur in Sudan, for Sri Lanka, Georgia, Burma, and many other countries. What is now important is to broaden the engagement of scientists and engineers in human rights work. And we at AAAS are going about doing that through something we call on-call scientists. It's a service we offer for matching human rights organizations with technical experts who can assist them. What I hope is that we'll be able to bring more engineers, particularly mechanical engineers, into this program and work with human rights organizations to determine how you can support their work. Engineers specifically have addressed human rights-related issues in several instances, and here are just two. The Mazibuko case is one that's been making its way through the South African courts since 2007, and it relates to the right to water. In this case, one question at issue was the minimum amount of water per day that needed to be provided to a person for their right to water to be fully realized. To answer this question, the Supreme Court of Appeal relied on the expert testimony of a civil engineer who manages a consultancy company with expertise in the development and transformation of water supply and sanitation in South Africa. The other case, this is of Kathy Lynn Henderson, who was awaiting execution on death row for the murder of an infant. However, when Edwin Newberg, a mechanical engineer, heard about the crime for which she had been convicted, he was concerned that biomechanics actually supported her alibi. To make a long story short, the new scientific evidence led to a stay of execution and may lead to a new trial for Kathy Henderson. That question is still to be considered. But the conclusion is that engineers, and mechanical engineers in particular, have much to contribute to human rights. The challenge is to identify a human rights question for which mechanical engineering and engineering more broadly may provide some response, and for mechanical engineers to become engaged more frequently and systematically in addressing human rights questions. Moving now to the fourth connection between engineering and human rights, and that is that engineering may have negative implications for human rights. And in the poll that you completed, you indicated that this is obviously an issue with which you're quite familiar, or that of which you're aware. It's arguable that protecting human rights is a professional responsibility of all scientists and engineers, just as complying with ethical standards is a responsibility of all. Now, I won't go into this issue in great detail at this stage, but I will explore this question in more detail later. For the time being, I do want to highlight three issues of particular relevance to mechanical engineering and human rights. One is the importance in any project of identifying the individuals or groups that may be considered vulnerable in a given community, engaging those individuals in a participatory process, and making sure that any project you undertake does not contribute to or exacerbate their vulnerability. While this goes without saying, it's important to highlight the absolute necessity of applying high-quality standards regardless of the particular culture or country in which you may be working. When you think about mitigating the effects of natural disasters, for example, ensuring high-quality construction standards is key. Finally, there are technologies that are developed by mechanical engineers and engineers more broadly that have dual uses. That is, one may be a legitimate military application, for example, but the use of the same technology in a civilian context may be inappropriate. Examples in the media currently include drones and long-range acoustical devices. Identifying the dual uses of such technologies and determining the precise context in which they should be used and which they should be not used is vital to ensuring the application of these technologies does not contribute to human rights violations. Finally, I want to address the question of whether there is a human right to benefit from engineering. You may recall I mentioned to you at the beginning of this webinar that the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Well, Article 15 of that treaty specifically refers to the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. In fact, the Covenant goes on to address the duty on governments to conserve, develop, and diffuse science, to respect the freedom indispensable for scientific research, and encourage international contacts and cooperation. Now first, it's important to acknowledge a failing in this language, which is its focus only on science, though the intention of the framers was to include not only researchers, but also practitioners, engineers, health professionals, and so forth. Another problem with this right is that, frankly, we don't know what it means yet. The right has been broadly accepted through ratification of the treaty. It's been incorporated into other international documents and even national constitutions. However, if the right is to be applied and truly have impact, we need to know what it means, and therefore we need to define it. To that end, in 2007, UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, started a process to define the right. The process took 3 years. It involved 3 experts meetings and involved, I hate to say it, very few scientists and no engineers. I participated as the only representative of a scientific organization. Nonetheless, at the end of the UNESCO process, certain conclusions were made, including that the right applies across all disciplines, including engineering, that it can be enjoyed individually as well as collectively, and that certain requirements must be met for it to be realized fully, that close international cooperation is required, as well as an enabling and participatory environment. The needs of marginalized and vulnerable populations must be given focus, and protection from abuse and the adverse effects of science and technology must be addressed. At the end of the process, it was also acknowledged that the scientific, and here I know the engineering community was intended to be included, as well as academic communities, needed to be brought into the process of defining the right. With that in mind, in April 2010, the Board of Directors of AAAS adopted a statement acknowledging the importance of this right to the scientific and engineering communities and undertaking to get the community involved in the process of defining the right. Through the coalition, we have developed a process of getting scientists and engineers involved. We are working with professional societies through a series of focus groups, and the ASME held its focus group earlier this year in New Orleans. We're going to compile the information we receive from this process and present it to the UN as part of their ongoing work to define this right and ultimately work towards its application. Now that you have a grounding in the fundamentals of human rights and their connection to engineering, I want to turn to what it means in practice to take a human rights-based approach to engineering. Now, discussing human rights with an audience of engineers and having seen the background of a lot of those who are in our audience, I think it's particularly important to distinguish what human rights work means as compared to development work, a field with which you, as an engineer, may be more familiar. A human rights-based approach requires an assessment of certain key issues and following certain processes. These processes include involving all affected communities in the design, development, implementation, and monitoring of a project. Involvement of all relevant groups in this way is a key factor in ensuring what's fondly referred to as the 4 A's: accessibility of a service or product that is being provided, ensuring it's acceptable culturally and in other ways, that it is adaptable to potentially changing circumstances, environmental and others, and that it is affordable to the population that it's intended to serve. Now, when working with affected communities, it's particularly key to ensure vulnerable or marginalized populations are engaged. When designing refugee camps, for example, involving women in decisions about the placement of lights, of latrines, of stoves, is vital to ensuring their safety. Transparency is also a basic principle of human rights, which is tied very directly to the right to information, particularly information about projects that may or will have an effect on people and how they live their lives. Here I think it worthwhile to mention the World Bank, a major funder of development projects around the world, projects in which engineers are often very much a part. The World Bank has developed several key processes related to the impact of the projects it funds on communities, including the involuntary resettlement policy, for example. This policy and others of the World Bank do not explicitly integrate human rights principles, though they are on topics of direct relevance. That's why it's important to highlight that the bank is currently undergoing a process to determine specifically how human rights principles do relate to their work and how they could be better integrated into their policies and programs. As mentioned earlier, human rights law binds governments, establishing their obligations to respect, to protect, and to fulfill human rights. At the same time, however, non-government actors share complementary responsibilities. These responsibilities were articulated most recently and comprehensively in the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights presented to the UN in March of last year. The details of these principles are relevant to the project design, development, and implementation processes of engineers, amongst others, and are intended to ensure that projects benefit the communities they're intended to serve without causing harm. According to the guiding principles, business enterprises should act with due diligence to avoid infringing on the rights of others and to address adverse impacts with which they are involved. On this slide, I've highlighted for you some of the key principles related to due diligence. While these may seem somewhat standard procedures, viewing this analysis through a human rights lens may require significantly different methods of assessment and produce different results than, for example, adopting a development or commercial lens. So the final question I'll address today is that of how you can become involved in human rights. Now, in my experience, really, the opportunities are limitless. And it really depends on how you choose to become involved. Some options involve volunteer activities and learning about human rights in your free time, while others allow you to incorporate human rights into your current work and professional activities. The suggestions I make on the slide include to increase your knowledge and understanding of human rights, raise awareness about human rights within your own organization, department, or company, use human rights to inform your work, apply your skills to human rights challenges, for example, in partnership with a human rights organization, or use human rights language explicitly in policy work. Now, I just want to share with you one final poll before I highlight some of the work that ASME has been doing, particularly in the area of human rights. So here is the poll. And what it's asking you is, what are you interested in doing with regard to human rights? Applying your skills to human rights, incorporating human rights into your teaching, and some of you have already indicated that you've done that, addressing human rights questions in your research, engaging your professional society in human rights, addressing human rights-related policy issues, or exploring how to incorporate human rights into project design. I'll give you a few moments to complete that before I share the results. Okay, well, thank you very much. There's obviously a very keen interest amongst our audience in applying your skills to human rights, engaging your professional society, and also exploring how you can incorporate human rights into project design. And now I'm not sure if this is a reflection of our audience and whether we have fewer teachers and researchers, but we have just 7% indicating that they have an interest in incorporating human rights into their teaching and 11% in addressing human rights questions in their research. Thank you very much for that. Now, I just want to highlight some of the wonderful work that ASME has been doing on human rights in the past year. Just in March of this year, as I mentioned in my presentation, ASME held a focus group on Article 15. Article 15 is the shorthand we use to refer to the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. And as I mentioned, we are working to bring in the perspectives of scientists, engineers, and health professionals to the UN process of defining the right. And we're doing that by holding focus groups with disciplinary-specific professional societies. So we did that with the ASME in March. We had a group of between 8 and 12 experts from various subfields within mechanical engineering. And over 2 hours, we held a very rich discussion about the connection between mechanical engineering and the precise meaning of the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. That focus group led to an article in asme.org, just a brief overview of where engineering and human rights meet. Then I had the privilege of working with Engineering for Change, of which ASME is a founding member. In April, E4C held one of its Connect gatherings here in Washington, D.C. in April, where we were able to hear in very practical ways how engineers, including mechanical engineers, are applying their skills their innovation, their entrepreneurial drive to aid in development and also in addressing human rights explicitly. And of course, we're holding this webinar now, and there's also a forthcoming article in the ME magazine exploring the connections between engineering and human rights. So with that, I want to thank you again for joining us for this webinar, and particularly to the ASME that has actively embraced the question of how mechanical engineering and human rights connect. With that, I'm going to turn back to our moderator, who I know has been reviewing questions that you've been submitting over the course of this presentation, and hopefully I'll have an opportunity to respond to as many of them as possible. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks, Jessica. That was a great presentation, and I think it looks like our viewers are indeed sending along questions here. But I do want to remind everyone out there that if you do have a question for Jessica, feel free to fill it in the box below the presentation window and submit it to us. And we do have a pretty good amount of time here for Q&A. If anyone has even a tricky question, we can probably get to it here. So here's the first question for you, Jessica. This viewer wants to know, and I'm sure this is something that goes through a lot of people's minds. As an engineer doing development work, I sometimes am afraid or feel that it is inappropriate to take the human rights approach. Can championing human rights be detrimental to the efficacy of an engineering project? I imagine people sitting in offices right now, might think it's a little bit of a sea shift to change gears and go and take this approach. So what are you thinking of that?
I think it's a wonderful question, and I think it is a fear, a concern that is shared by many members of the engineering community. I think, first of all, it's important to highlight that taking a human rights approach, as our audience member puts it, can mean many different things. What I tried to suggest in my presentation was really just that. It's how to use human rights in the design of programs, in how you execute those programs, potentially how you evaluate those programs. So it's an approach that can be quite internal to program design. There is, of course, the more activist approach that some individuals and groups take to human rights, that is more about policy change, that is more about legislative change, and so forth. I don't think that is necessarily an integral part of what an engineer who's involved in a development project would need to do, and certainly what they would be expected to do. So when our audience member talks about championing human rights, I think as I say, there are various ways of doing that, and I think incorporating the human rights framework and approach into program design, development, implementation, evaluation should not be detrimental to professional development or to the implementation of a project. I actually think that the human rights approach can increase the viability and sustainability of a project, particularly as it requires the involvement of members of relevant groups that are going to be affected by the project. So as I said, I think human rights can actually contribute very strongly to projects, and there shouldn't be a fear that taking this approach is going to be in any way detrimental.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, we have another viewer who has an interesting question as well. This person would like to know, do engineers have a right to comply with engineering ethics and the kinds of issues we're discussing? Because if so, there really is no precedent for, or this person feels there's no precedent for defending this right on the part of engineers. If you put yourself out there, what safeguards are there, in other words?
So this is a question of what structures might be in place to protect engineers whose rights are violated in a particular circumstance. Am I understanding the question correctly?
That was my understanding, yeah.
Okay. Well, that's actually something that we have done quite some work on, and you will find that within the scientific and the engineering communities, the extent to which most professional societies have engaged in human rights has been on the question of how to protect the human rights of members of their discipline. And the way professional societies often do that is to actually have a human rights committee that is dedicated to identifying members of their profession who are being threatened, who are being persecuted, and identifying the most appropriate way of addressing their needs. So I mentioned two cases of individuals who had spoken out on human rights issues. One had done so very much as a mechanical engineer. He really identified himself as such, and that brought particular credibility to his claims. I believe the other individual was undertaking more of a personal role in his human rights stance, but he was also an engineer, both of whom were arrested for their public statements on human rights. And with their cases, there have been many different organizations that have been involved in trying to highlight those individual cases, bringing attention to them, but hopefully also encouraging the government to take a different stance on their treatment of those individuals. So, for example, the National Academy of Sciences, they have a human rights committee. The work of that committee is not public. The approach that they have favored is quiet diplomacy. That may be diplomacy with the government in question, that may be diplomacy with an embassy, a local embassy, or with professional groups within the country concerned. There are other organizations such as Scholars at Risk. The role that they play is to provide an intellectual safe haven for scholars, and scholars include academics, scientists, engineers who are at risk, and providing them, as I said, an intellectual safe haven. And what I mean by that is they identify sponsors. So a university agrees to sponsor an individual and provide an academic position for them for a given amount of time, so that that person can leave their country if need be and continue their professional development. So there are various ways in which this kind of work to protect engineers, to protect scientists, is going on. I hope that's answered that person's question.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, and there's sort of a related question here that I think is very interesting. A viewer wants to know, this is sort of a broad question, but they'd like to know what the connection is between religious freedoms and human rights. And maybe you could talk, I'm sure it connects in many ways. They mention if your religious conviction tells you to do something, is that a human right? And I assume maybe you could even talk to the broader issue of, do you see religious organizations involved very often in human rights issues and things of that nature around the world?
Certainly. There are various ways in which you could answer this question. Taking the last piece of what you just said, Dave, there are many religious organizations that do take a very active role locally and internationally in addressing human rights and humanitarian issues. I probably don't need to go into great detail because I think a lot of the members of our audience would know about that type of work. So the broader question that is being asked by the audience member is, how does religious freedom connect to engineering ethics? And I think what we're talking about are related, overlapping, but also distinct areas. So when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about a body of standards, a body of norms that a profession has agreed to as guiding or binding the work that they do. I think when you're talking about religious freedom, you're talking about individual convictions that, again, guide an individual in how they pursue their work and their personal lives. And when we're talking about human rights, what we're talking about are legal standards. As I said in my sort of introduction to what are human rights, we're talking about standards that are set out in law. And in many instances, there will be overlaps between what ethical standards may say and what is included in human rights, and also religious convictions. And obviously, in human rights, there is a protection of an individual's right to express their religious beliefs. And I'm not sure if that answers that audience member's question, but that's the best I can do right now.
No, that was very good. It's a touchy and enormous issue, so I think that answers it adequately. We do have another question from someone here who would like to know sort of more of a nuts and bolts kind of a question. If they would like to get involved in human rights engineering and do this as more than just a volunteer basis on a couple of hours on here and there, what would they need to do in order to either retrain or re-educate or somehow, I imagine if you're working for a large corporation right now and you wanted to be on the ground in Darfur at some point, you would have to make a pretty big shift in your thinking, and you'd have to probably know something about the legal issues involved, any of the large issues involved. So I wondered what you thought there.
Yeah, we seem to have a couple of questions along that line of people who would like to dedicate time to human rights but don't know how to get involved and what it means for their professional retraining, potentially. And what I have to say at the beginning is that the great value that a mechanical engineer can bring to human rights is their technical expertise. So I think making sure that you maintain those expertise, the skills and the knowledge that comes of being a mechanical engineer is important, very important, if you want to provide strength in human rights work. At the same time, it is necessary to, in any given context, be aware of what might be cultural differences that could impact your work or to which you should be sensitive even in your interpersonal relations. It's important to understand the assumptions that a human rights group with which you may be working comes. We work a lot with engineers and with scientists who contribute their skills to human rights, and they obviously bring a rigorous method. They bring a commitment to clarity, to peer review often, to their work, and these may not be concepts with which a human rights organization is as familiar. And when I say that, I don't refer to what I said about clarity. So I think it's important for both parties to understand the assumptions that they bring to a partnership. And in fact, some of the work that we're doing at the moment through the coalition is developing a guide to assist human rights organizations understand the assumptions that a scientist or an engineer brings in its work. And similarly, in this case, for example, an engineer, to understand what a human rights organization brings to a partnership. So I don't think re-education is necessary. I think maintaining technical expertise is very important, but educating yourself about the particular context in which you're working is vital.
Okay. Well, we have another question here, which I think is a little, maybe a little too broad for you to answer, but it kind of leads to a more important question. We had someone who wanted to know what the difference was between human rights in India and the United States. But what that kind of opens up is that we have a lot of viewers here on this very webinar who are international. They're not necessarily in offices in New York or Washington, and maybe they're not in a place where you can just march down to the corner office and join a program or make your voice heard. What kind of issues do you think there are internationally, and in terms of human rights here versus human rights there, and the engineers' rights here and the engineers' rights there?
That's an exceptionally broad question. Well, first I want to say anybody who is part of our audience internationally who's interested in getting involved in human rights work, I mentioned our On-Call Scientist program, and through that program we have over 700 volunteers, including I think at the moment, in 36 different countries. So you don't need to be US-based to be part of that volunteer network that I'm talking about. At the same time, the experience that we've had is that, just as in our audience here, we have a lot of mechanical engineers who are very keen to apply their skills to human rights, but don't know where their skills are most needed. At the same time, I think there are many human rights organizations that are still grappling with how can they use science technology, how can they work with scientists and engineers to strengthen their work. And I think what is key is opening up the dialogue and bridging the two communities. So anyone who's interested in doing this, one potential starting point is to identify strong, effective human rights organizations in your region that may be working on areas relevant to your expertise. So, for example, there are a lot of human rights organizations doing work related to soil and water contamination, to access to potable water, to access simple but effective mobile health technologies. Identifying those groups and just presenting yourself to them and explaining the type of work you do and trying to find those connections. In many countries, there are also something called national human rights institutions. These are set up under legislation, but these institutions, if they are effective, must be independent of government. And again, they should have a broad overarching idea of human rights issues relevant in that country, and presenting yourself to them and identifying how you may be able to assist is another suggestion that I have.
Well, we have actually a couple of viewers who have asked the same question, and this one should be a little easier for you. On a local and immediate basis, so what can someone do who is simply looking to volunteer for a few hours, maybe 4 or 5 per week? And these are asked from U.S.-based viewers, something they can do. Habitat for Humanity comes to mind, but, anything that you know of where you can get started immediately doing something.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of organizations working in the U.S. The question is, do you want to be applying your skills as a mechanical engineer, or are you interested in learning first about human rights broadly? If the second is what you're interested in, then there are many organizations. As you mentioned, Habitat for Humanity is one. Amnesty International, obviously, is another. So finding those kinds of groups that have many local chapters is a way of getting involved. We're also trying to explore the connections between, for example, mechanical engineering and human rights by developing course curricula that can be used at the graduate level, that might be used for students within mechanical engineering or human rights students to understand how, in this case, mechanical engineering is relevant to their work. Working with us and identifying, conceptualizing those links, writing up case studies. That's a longer-term project, and maybe it's not as tangible as what the audience member was looking for, but there are many different options.
Okay. We have someone else here who has a more straightforward question for you. They'd like to know how they can join the On-Call Scientist database. In other words, are there any specific qualifications or conditions necessary to join?
Sure. So you join online. We joke it's like an online dating service. So the experts sign up online, and the human rights organizations request experts online. We require that you have a minimum of a master's degree and 2 years of professional experience, and that's really it in terms of minimum qualifications. Then when we get a request for a particular expertise, we go through the database, identify who might be relevant, and then have a discussion with them, seek references, and so forth. But a master's and 2 years of work experience is the minimum we require.
Okay. I think we may have one more here. Here's a good question from someone in academia, and this person would like to know if there's any way they can identify projects specifically for undergraduates that are relevant to a particular human rights issue. Maybe you could speak to the issue ways students can get involved?
Absolutely. As I mentioned in our coalition meeting that's coming up in mid-July, we actually have two professors who are going to be talking to the issue of how they integrate human rights into their engineering curricula. And what's really exciting about engineering is that you provide the opportunity for students to become practically engaged. It depends on whether the professor wants to work locally or internationally. There are several examples of professors who take their students internationally to work on projects using, as I mentioned in response to the first question, using the human rights framework to design the project, to implement it, and to evaluate it. If that person wants to email me directly, I can put them in touch with various professors who are doing this kind of work. I should also say that with our On-Call Science project, sometimes what we've done is we have matched an expert who is a graduate professor, for example, and in their project they have supervised the work of their students who have been a part of the project. So that's also an opportunity that we're open to.
Okay. Well, I think we are just about reaching the end of our time here. I've had multiple questions asking if I could put up your contact information again. So here it is. There is Jessica's title and organization and email address for any questions for her. Although, as we've mentioned previously, we will try to answer all of these questions after the event itself. So I think that's about all we have time for today. But I'd really like to thank sincerely our speaker, Jessica, for such an informative and interesting presentation. We really appreciated you being here today, Jessica.
Thank you very much, Dave. It's been a great pleasure. And, well, I look forward to maintaining contact with the members of our audience who are obviously very interested in this issue, are already contributing, and seem keen to do even more.
All right, and that does bring me to my next point, which is that as a reminder to those of you who had questions today that were not answered live, please remember that we will be answering all questions via email after the event. And when I say we, I mean Jessica, because she's the expert here. So on behalf of the ASME, the AAAS, and E4C, I'd like to thank you all once again for joining us today. And please look for more events like this one from ASME.org in the future. Have a good day.